Farrier lived for iron, not conversation. Before dawn, he found a stranger at his door. Breath shallow, dressed dark with blood, an infant bundled against her chest. By sundown, a posse would ride through, asking about stolen payroll and a woman who should already be dead. He could point east, close his gate, keep the quiet he trusted. Instead, he carried her inside, stoked the forge, and let the first spark choose everyone's fate. Elias Brand banked the coals for morning shoeing, the anvil already sweating from night heat. He turned toward the draft and saw the woman on the threshold, skin gray, dress torn, belly flat again only because pain had emptied it. A baby girl, barely hours old, fussed inside a ragged quilt. No hoofprints marked the frost. Whoever abandoned them had walked backward, erasing every sign. He lifted the child first, tucked her beneath his coat so her cheek pressed his heartbeat. Then he laid the woman on the forge cot and trimmed the sleeve away from her wound. The bullet sat under the collarbone, shallow but lodged. Whiskey hissed against metal tweezers, and she came to just long enough to whisper a single thing. "Leah!" The word cracked apart as soon as it left her throat. Elias showed her his own name by tapping the leather apron where the initials EB were burned, then touched the scar across his voice box. No speech. She closed her eyes, accepting both facts. He worked quickly, heated water, steadied her shoulder, teased the slug out. She never screamed, only breathed like someone counting seconds until the world decided yes or no. When the bullet struck a tin cup with a dull ring, her eyes rolled back and she slipped under. The baby struggled for warmth. Goat's milk warmed in a tin canteen, cooled against his wrist, then dripped between small lips. She swallowed greedily and fell asleep to the sound of the forge draft humming above her. Near noon, a column of dust formed on the road. 5 riders wearing new coats and cleaner guns than the land required. Elias stepped into the yard, palms open. The leader held up a circular. Woman wanted alive. Rail payroll theft. Infant with her. The sketch looked enough like the woman bleeding inside to hang her twice. The farrier drew a finger across his throat. Mute. And pointed west. Like most men who run on rumors and rewards, the posse preferred the next horizon. They rode off, cursing wasted daylight. Inside, Leah's fever climbed. Elias crushed willow bark, sweetened it with the last spoon of honey, and fed her by the half sip until her trembling eased. She woke during the blue hour, found her child asleep in a feed crate lined with clean straw, saw the stitched shoulder, and understood the cost. She mouthed, "Thank you," but sound never followed. He set a slate in her hands. She wrote one question with a shaking finger. Name. He chalked 3 letters, R-O-W-A-N. Leah traced them, nodded, then wrote his in return. For the first time in months, Elias Brand saw his own name written by someone else's hand. It looked heavier that way. Over the next 3 days, routine stitched itself together. Leah rose in cautious increments, froze whenever the baby cried, then relaxed when no punishment followed. Elias shod 2 colts with softer hammer strokes so Rowan kept sleeping. When he returned from the trough, he'd find coffee brewed the bitter way he liked, though he'd never told a soul that preference. Survival had trained her eye to details. Kindness slowly trained it to linger. On the 4th morning, the wind snapped a shutter and dropped it hard. Porcelain shattered on the hearthstone, and Leah crumpled in the corner, arms over her head. Elias knelt, swept the shards without a word, set a new mug on the table, filled it with the same tea, the same sugar. He left her alone to test the silence. Minutes passed before she finally reached for the handle, hands shaking less than before. That night her door stayed open a sliver. Invitation, not surrender. Snow arrived early. Rowan's breath fogged in the lamplight, so Elias split cedar until sweat cut rivers under his shirt. Leah draped blankets over the forge rafters to trap heat. When the baby's fist opened and closed as though grasping coals of air, Elias forged a tiny horseshoe charm from scrap and hung it above the crate. The child gazed at it until sleep pooled over her eyes. A week later, the posse returned, angrier, thinner, trailing broken rumors. They searched the barn, found nothing but iron and feed. One man kicked the baby crate, but saw only straw. Elias stood motionless, fists quiet. Leah, pressed flat behind the forge chimney, held Rowan so close her heartbeat served as lullaby. When the men rode off, her knees failed, but gratitude kept her upright long enough to meet Elias's gaze. Silent pact sealed. Winter tightened its fist. Feed bins emptied too fast. Money hid in shadows. Elias stared at the burned-away poster he had fed to the flames, weighing reward against honor. He chose steel over silver, 3 cedar rails sold to a neighbor for flour, seed, powdered milk. Leah thanked him by mending the torn seam in his coat, each stitch straight as a fence post. Rowan found her first laugh, sharp as a hammer strike, when snowflakes landed on her tongue. Days shortened but felt larger. Leah swept iron filings into perfect lines, practiced walking circles to rebuild her strength. Elias practiced believing the floorboards would welcome a second set of footsteps for longer than one season. When Rowan's eyes finally tracked both of them with equal trust, past and future shifted places. Grief lost its hold. On the evening solstice, they stood outside the forge. Stars ignited over an arroyo, no longer cloaked in dust. The forge behind them exhaled a steady glow. The child in Elias's arms breathed soft against his throat. Leah brushed her fingers over his scar, then over her own shoulder stitch. 2 wounds, 1 answer. She whispered a single word, almost too soft for wind to carry. Home. Elias couldn't echo it with sound, so he nodded just once. Under the clear winter sky, it was louder than speech. Snow arrived before the road froze. Elias stored feed inside the forge, stacking each sack where heat from the hearth would keep it dry. Leah watched, Rowan balanced on her hip. She still moved slow, but the fever had stayed down for a week. Scar tissue stiffened her shoulder. She stretched it each dawn, teeth clenched until the pull eased. A single rider came from Prescott, Sheriff Dawes. He dismounted, hat in hand. Elias met him at the gate, silent, eyes asking. Dawes spoke low. Posse turned up nothing. Payroll pouch found empty 2 counties south. Your place clear. He handed a sealed letter. A full pardon for any woman formerly known as Leah Finch. Railroad charges dropped. Elias tipped his head. Thanks. Leah read the paper inside. Breath caught, shoulders dropped as if a rope had been cut from her ribs. She hid the document under a floorboard, safe but unseen. Winter held the valley tight. With every colt shoed or hinge mended, Elias left 3 coins on the table. Leah matched him, selling cedar figurines to ranch wives who visited for fresh shoes. By New Year, a small tin box held more dollars than Elias had touched in 5 years. January wind cracked a seam in the forge roof. At midnight, sleet rattled the gap. Water dripped onto the anvil, hissed. Elias climbed the rafters with tar and felt. Leah braced the ladder, Rowan strapped to her chest. One misstep. Elias slipped, leg hanging through a rotten plank. Pain lit his eyes white. Leah steadied the ladder, pried the board free, helped him down. A sprain, not a break, but his knee ballooned. She splinted it with cedar slats, boiled comfrey, and kept the forge warm, while he surrendered the hammer for the first time since boyhood. 3 weeks he hobbled. Leah rose earlier, hefted shoes to the fire, shaped them slower but true. Customers said nothing about the change. They paid the same. Elias stood by, correcting with silent gestures, pride bruised yet humbled by her steady hands. Rowan learned to crawl between cooling legs of finished shoes. Leah tied small bells to the child's sleeves so metal warned before little fingers touched hot iron. Elias smiled. No sound, but the lines near his eyes softened. In March, the coal cart overturned on Frostbend Road. Teamster limped into the yard asking for help, right as another squall rolled in. Elias couldn't haul with his knee. Leah hitched the bay, pulled coal and cart upright, then drove the load 5 miles to the rail spur before dark. That night, the teamster's wife arrived with a pie and a sack of seed. For the family, she said. Leah blinked at the word, accepted both. Spring melt burst the arroyo banks. Water waist deep cut the only road east. A fever wagon from Dustin tried the crossing anyway. Tipped. Elias heard screams over hammer clang. He and Leah waded in, ropes tied to fence posts. They dragged 3 children out, blue-lipped but breathing. Leah's scar split, blood mixing with mud. She hardly noticed. Dawes rode in 2 days later with blankets and praise. He asked if Elias would testify to her courage at town meeting. Elias tapped his throat, shrugged. Dawes grinned. Silent witness is still witness. At the meeting he stood, wrote 3 words on a slate. She saved lives. Applause filled the room, louder than any sermon. Leah stood behind him, Rowan in arms, cheeks hot. No posse would chase her again. The county now owed her. They planted the seed from the teamster's wife. Rows of beans and a single slim apple whip. Rowan patted behind, dropping pebbles like treasures. Elias dug a hole for a fence post, found the bullet he'd removed from Leah months back. He set it in the post top, hammered it flush. Memory turned marker. Summer grass reached stirrup high, feed plenty. Elias forged a toy horse from scrap. Leah carved its saddle. Rowan dragged it by a string across the yard, dust trailing like a comet tail. Laughter bubbled each time the wheels hit a stone. It sounded like water over iron. One hot dusk, Leah leaned against the doorframe, watching Elias shoe a colt. She touched the scar under her collar, then his dead voice scar. Question unvoiced. He wiped sweat, chalked on the anvil. Pain stops here. She traced the words, nodded, stepped closer, rested her palm on his chest. Rowan squealed, crawled between them, fists grabbing trouser cuffs. They laughed. A low rasp from Elias, a soft exhale from Leah. 2 broken sounds shaping one clear note. Night cooled. They sat on the stoop, Rowan asleep against Leah's shoulder. Stars came up slow. Elias slid a small ring, from a shoe nail bent and polished, onto Leah's finger. She didn't speak, only tightened her grip around his hand. Silence answered. Complete. Beyond the forge, the arroyo whispered under moonlight, carrying no dust, only water, and the promise it keeps. Summer heat pressed all color from the valley. Creek beds cracked, and grass turned the shade of old rope. Elias woke before dawn, knee still stiff, to ration water between forge, animals, and the row of beans Leah guarded like a promise. Rowan followed on unsteady feet, dragging her scrap metal horse through dust that never settled. Collins Creek Ranch lost 24 head in a single week. The old rancher rode over, hat in hand, asking if Elias could spare cedar for new troughs. Elias nodded, but the cart sat on blocks. His knee still would not lift the tongue. Leah hitched the bay herself, lashed Rowan's cradle into the wagon box, and drove the load at noon, heat shimmering over iron rims. By nightfall, troughs stood ready, cattle alive for another sunrise. Collins sent back a sack of oats and a shy question. Would Leah accept full pay for her time? She shook her head, pointed to Rowan, payment already carried home. Dust storms followed heat. They scoured paint from the paddock rails and polished every horseshoe bright as coin. Rowan coughed till her ribs rattled. Leah laid wet cloth over the cot, kept ash out of the forge, and read from Elias's one book, an almanac with pages softer than linen. Words meant little, but her voice meant cool water when the child woke afraid. Mid-July, a stranger in a stiff canvas suit arrived on a sorrel mare, too fine for road dust. He introduced himself with a banker's card, Milton Charles, land surveyor for the Prescott and Western Rail Spur. He spoke to Elias as though the scar were a language barrier to be talked over. Company needs a water stop. Your arroyo fits. We're ready to buy. Elias shook his head. Charles smiled the way men smile at soft metal before bending it. He left an envelope with a draft contract and a date 3 weeks hence. Leah read every clause that night by lamplight, jaw tightening with each penalty for refusal. She reached for Rowan, as though closeness were a tool sharper than law. Next morning, Elias melted the contract into the forge, ash scattering across new shoes. Leah watched paper curl, but worry stayed. She sharpened her carving knife, sliced cedar into scripts Rowan could later use as letters. When the child slept, Leah traced roots on the slate. Arroyo here, ridge there. Fallback lines sketched like footprints to an unseen horizon. 5 days later, 2 men rode with Charles. One carried a survey tripod, the other a revolver worn smooth at the grip. Leah met them at the gate, rifle across her skirt. Rowan balanced at her hip. Charles removed his hat, not out of respect, but calculation. We'll place markers. No harm in that, he said. Elias stepped beside her, hammer dangling loose but ready. Charles noted the iron, reconsidered, and left survey lines uncut for the day. At dusk, Dawson, the sheriff, stopped by, hearing rumors of eminent domain. Rail had muscle, he admitted, but public meetings still mattered. Leah thanked him with coffee. Rowan offered him a shoenail ring she'd found in the dust. Dawson smiled, promise thin but present. At the meeting, Rail lawyers cited progress, jobs, future. Leah stood only once, child on her forearm, and said 12 words. This arroyo saved your cattle and your children when water failed. Silence followed long enough to taste. Votes split, but Ty favored the current owner. The survey crew had to wait. Charles did not wait quietly. 2 nights later, the barn roof caught flame. Lantern kicked or match tossed. Elias woke to the roar, dragged Tack outside while Leah hauled buckets. Rowan strapped across her back, coughing. The fire died before rafters collapsed, thanks to wet feed sacks and months of practice bucket work. Morning smoke revealed hoof prints circling south, coins from Collins's last payment scattered like breadcrumbs. Charles's calling card sat in the ashes, edge charred. Sheriff Dawson couldn't prove the card, but he deputized Collins' boys to patrol after dark. Leah nailed fresh tin over the roof holes. Elias forged a new gate latch, one that locked from inside with a hidden pin Rowan alone could reach by crawling. August broke heat records, yet the beans lived. Roots deep in the soil, Rowan watered from her own small crock. The rail project stalled. Investors argued. Charles vanished without boot prints. Elias and Leah repaired the mare's harness, trading labor for seed wheat. The valley took note. Quiet Haven fixed what broke, asked little, gave more. Rowan turned 3 on a windy day. Neighbors arrived piecemeal, leaving gifts. A quilt square, a sack of nails, a single apple from Collins' struggling tree. Leah baked bread with all the saved oats, crust cracking like good news. Elias fashioned a toy anvil just light enough for small hands. Rowan hammered imaginary shoes onto a stick horse until dusk. That night, Leah found Elias at the creek bed, tracing the waterline now rich with autumn melt. She rested head to his shoulder. He touched the bullet scar that once cursed her, thumb brushing healed skin. She whispered one line into the wind. Past can't steal what's given back. He answered by guiding her hand to his throat, letting the silent heartbeat speak. They walked home under a sky clear enough to hear. The forge glowed through the window, steady as a North Star. Tomorrow, drought or flood, rail or quiet, the hammer would rise. Because home was no longer a place to defend, but the place from which everything worth striking began. First frost glazed the forge roof before dawn. Elias lit the fire early so the anvil would warm before iron. Rowan pressed her palms to the glowing bricks, counting heartbeats until heat reached her fingertips. Leah lifted the child onto a stool, tying back loose curls with a strip of feed sack cloth. The valley whispered of a hard winter. Collins Creek lost its well when the windlass rotted through. Dunning boys found wolves pacing the north ridge. Quiet Haven answered each worry. Elias reset the windlass shaft. Leah brewed stewed beans for the hunters. Gratitude came as flour, split rails, stories shared at low volume. Snowstorm number 1 arrived early December, thick flakes smothering fence lines and hiding every road marker. A stage sputtered north, lost its wheel in a drift, and limped into the yard. 4 passengers, 1 driver near frostbite. Elias rolled the forge bellows until the air sizzled with warmth. Leah cleaned chilblains with tallow and cloth. Rowan offered each stranger a cedar token, small comfort against big cold. At dusk, a scout reached the yard. Rail crews had pitched camp 4 miles east, new investors backing a last-minute winter push. They intended to cut through the ridge by blasting sandstone, cheaper than buying water rights. Quiet Haven, Arroyo and all, would sit under avalanche risk. Elias stared at the map the scout unrolled. Powder lines, blast markers, dates set 2 weeks ahead. He pressed chalk to slate. The ridge holds water. Blast floods valley. Scout shrugged. Company says runoff heads west. Leah traced elevation lines, pointed to Collins Creek bend, shook her head. If the blast went as drawn, half the herds would drown in spring melt. Next day, neighbors filled the forge. Sheriff listened first, rubbed beard, cursed quietly. Collins spoke second. We fight papers with paper, or we pull powder line at night. Eyes turned to Elias. Silence held weight. He wrote 3 words. Stop the blast. Agreement settled like iron on anvil. The plan was simple, dangerous. Remove the blasting caps and relocate the kegs before the crew's sunrise inspection. Sheriff preferred legal briefs, but lawyers rode slow in snow. Gunpowder waited for no one. Night before action, Elias oiled his knee brace, checked the old shotgun, filled it with rock salt. Enough sting, no graves. Leah sharpened the carving knife, tucked Rowan under quilts at Clara Kellerman's house. Rowan didn't cry. She handed Elias the horseshoe charm for luck. A half moon slid between clouds as 6 riders approached the rail camp. Elias, Leah, Colin's boys, Sheriff, and Clara's oldest nephew, wide-eyed, eager. They dismounted beyond lantern light and walked the last 100 yards. Elias cut fuse lines with hammer-chilled fingers. Leah levered kegs onto sled runners. Sheriff watched the sentry trail rotate, counting breath. One guard turned early, spotted silhouettes. Shouts cracked. A rail enforcer fired into the dark. Rock salt answered, ripping sparks off a shovel blade. Collins's younger boy yanked the fuse spool, sprinted into shadows. Leah faced a charging foreman, carving knife low. Foreman slipped on ice before steel touched cloth. Elias swung the hammer butt once. Clean. Man dropped. They dragged 5 kegs into the arroyo mouth, buried them under a drift. By sunrise, rail cap engineer found fuses cut, powder missing, footprints scrambled by mule hooves. Crew chief cursed sabotage and storm, suspended blasting until supplies arrived. None would before thaw. Sheriff filed a safety injunction the same afternoon. Grounds unstable, livestock at risk. Judge signed it. Rail lawyers sputtered, demanded proof. Collins offered to dynamite the judge's own orchard for demonstration. Hearing postponed till spring. Quiet Haven hosted bruises and laughter that evening. Leah rinsed salt burns from Colin's boy's shoulder. Elias hammered a new nail into the shelf for Rowan's charm. Victory trophy. January deepened. Snow erased every sound except forge hiss and baby giggles. One midnight, Rowan woke gasping, croup burning her tiny chest. Leah swaddled steam cloths. Elias rode for Doc Mecklin through knee-high drifts. Horse stumbled twice. Elias ran the last mile. Doc arrived before dawn, mixed onion syrup and turpentine rub. Rowan's breathing eased by sunrise. Leah's tears froze on her cheeks, unashamed. Doc refused payment in coin, asked instead for 2-seater toys, one for his own quiet grandson. Leah carved a locomotive, wheels smooth. Elias forged a tiny bell that rang clear when shaken. Doc rode away whistling. Late winter sun melted ridge caps. Water trickled into the arroyo. Soft music under ice. Elias and Leah walked the bank, watching current test new paths. He slipped his hand into hers. No hesitation now. She pressed her head against his arm, whispered, "Spring might still break us." He tapped his heart twice, steady, then traced Rowan's initial in the cold mud. Family was weight and anchor both. The week before thaw, rail lawyers returned with new papers. Amended route. Blast zone shifted south, just far enough to spare the arroyo. Quiet Haven kept its water. Collins Creek kept its herds. Sheriff posted the agreement on the church door. Victory printed in black ink. Neighbors gathered for stew and coffee in the forge, lanterns throwing long shadows. Elias raised his cup. Silence filled the room as if waiting for words he could not give. Instead, Leah spoke, voice firm now, scars pale under lamplight. This forge saved 3 hearts, then saved a valley. Keep listening to quiet places. Mugs clinked. Rowan toddled between boots, bell chiming new hope. Outside, snowmelt mapped silver veins through thirsty earth, promising green none of them could yet see. Early spring painted the valley in 2 colors, dark mud below, bright sky above. Rowan stamped through puddles, bell on her sleeve chiming with each splash. Leah followed, coat flapping loose, scar hidden under new fabric Colin's wife had sewn. Elias set the last shoe on Colin's roan and watched steam rise from the animal's flank into morning light. For the first time in years, the anvil had no backlog. Every promise was up to date. Sheriff Dawes rode in afternoon, dismounted stiff-legged, and handed Elias a folded sheet. Prescott and Western had rerouted again, permanently this time. No more blast markers. The arroyo and ridge were now listed on county maps as Haven Water Reserve under local stewardship. Dawes tapped the paper, grinning. Can't dynamite a public well without voters chewing your hide. Leah exhaled so slowly the sound barely rose above the horse's snort. Water kept its word. Melt filled the creek, then swallowed half the lower pasture in shallow, glimmering sheets. Cattle waded knee-deep and fattened on fresh shoots. Elias cut a channel with Collins' boys, guiding overflow into a trench that stopped just shy of the forge. Rowan watched, dirt streaking her cheeks. Wooden horse balanced on the ditch bank. When water reached the toy's carved hooves, she cheered, a noise almost too big for her lungs. Leah's shoulder healed enough for full reach. She strung new wire across the loft window to keep swallows from nesting above the baby's cradle. One evening, she found Elias tracing the bullet he had set flush into the fence post months earlier. Without speaking, he pried it free, walked to the forge, and melted it into a slender bar. Under Leah's fingertips, it cooled into a simple pendant. Mute metal turned memory. She slipped the chain over her head. The weight settled at her collarbone like closure. Rowan's 4th birthday arrived on a breezy day. Wind scattered apple blossoms over the yard like ash from an old grief turned sweet. Neighbors came with simple gifts, jars of honey, patched overalls, a hand-sewn kite Clara claimed would fly even in stubborn air. Sheriff brought a small cornet, said the valley finally needed music you could hear. Rowan puffed 3 notes. Every dog within a mile answered. When dusk folded over the party, Collins wheeled in a keg of creek cold cider. Adults leaned against corral rails, talking slow. Rowan fell asleep on Leah's lap. Elias placed a blanket over them both, then stepped into the forge. He pulled the hinge pin from the big door, hammered it flat, rounded the ends, and stamped 3 letters, E-L-R. He set it on the shelf beside the iron bird, the cedar nest, and the horseshoe charm. The plank bowed a little under the new weight, but did not crack. That summer drought threatened again, but Haven Water Reserve fed side channels to every neighbor. No cattle died, rail crews laid tracks south without fanfare, and survey stakes near the ridge turned to fence posts for a shared pasture. Leah carved a small map of the new water lines, gifting it to Dawes. He hung it in the church vestibule. Elias's knee ceased its constant ache. He taught Rowan to hold a rasp, let her file the edges of a cold shoe until sparks no longer scared her. Leah watched, arms folded, eyes soft. At night she read the same almanac pages, but now she paused over seed charts and weather signs, planting rows of vegetables that would follow the beans next year. Autumn came gentle. Apple trees bowed under first fruit. Collins borrowed a ladder, but returned with pies. On the evening the first frost eased across the valley, Leah stepped outside carrying a lantern, Rowan tugging her skirt. Elias followed, hammer in his belt as habit. They walked to the trench, now dry, and set the lantern on a flat stone. Leah placed the melted bullet pendant beside it. She spoke quietly. Here's the end of what chased us. Rowan repeated the gesture with her wooden horse. And here's the start. Elias pressed his hand over both offerings, then guided them into the shallow ditch. The lantern's reflection danced over past and future at once. Winter waited, but without menace this time. Snow covered new rails in the south, and trains whistled past Haven without taking anything away. Rowan learned to whistle back, 3 sharp notes the dogs had to respect. Leah's shoulders no longer flinched at sudden sounds. Elias found his silence now felt chosen, not stolen. On the last day of the year, a thin crescent moon hung above the forge. Friends drifted in with small fireside stories and mugs of spiced cider. When midnight neared, Dawes asked Leah for a few words. She stood, Rowan's hand in hers, and spoke just one sentence, voice steady through the hush. Quiet kept us alive. Kindness made us stay. No one needed more. Elias raised his mug. Neighbors followed. Steam curled into cold night air, hanging for a long breath before it vanished. Proof that even what disappears can warm you first. If this quiet road warmed you, press that like button dust flat, hitch your wagon by subscribing, and ride back when the next small spark rises from the forge.